Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be exploring one of the absolute most remarkable national transformations in all of human history. The story of Australia presents us with this incredible modern paradox. Think about it. Today, Australia boasts some of the highest living standards anywhere on the planet. I mean, cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane are literally always dominating those global livability indexes, totally renowned for top-tier healthcare, education, and stability. But the origins of this modern powerhouse, well, they are rooted in something incredibly harsh and unforgiving. So let's dive right into this.
Just think about this contrast for a second. Today, the average Australian guy can expect to live past 81, and for women, it's past 85. But rewind just over 150 years ago to 1870. A newborn child in Australia was expected to live, on average, to the age of just 34. For a huge chunk of its early post-European settlement history, life there meant grueling, arduous labor in a totally punishing environment, because the place was governed purely as a penal colony. So the big question we're tackling today is, how in the world did a place designed literally to punish people transform into a place where people all over the globe aspire to live?
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the first Australians and their 65,000-year history.
To really understand Australia, we have to go back to the very beginning. Long before any European ships arrived, this giant landmass was already thriving. 65,000. That's an absolutely massive number, and it represents the number of years the continent of Australia has been continuously inhabited. Migrants from Southeast Asia actually first arrived right at the end of the last ice age. That means the ancestors of modern Aboriginal peoples have called this continent home for tens of thousands of years, spreading all the way from the Torres Strait up in the north, right down to Tasmania in the south.
And we're not just talking about a handful of scattered groups here. By the time Europeans arrived, the First Nations of Australia were made up of over 500 unique tribal groups, and every single one of these groups had their own distinct languages, cultures, and territories. For countless generations, life in Aboriginal Australia continued undisturbed, maintaining this deep, incredible equilibrium with the environment. That is, of course, until the European Age of Discovery completely disrupted the course of history.
Moving right along to Section 2, a harsh penal colony, and the arrival of the first fleet.
So back in the 17th century, European explorers were obsessed with searching for this massive southern landmass they called Terra Australis. They basically believed it had to exist just to balance out the continents in the northern hemisphere. The Dutch actually hit land first. In 1606, Willem Jansson mapped part of the coast. Then, in 1642, Abel Tasman sighted what he called Van Diemen's Land, which we now know as Tasmania. But honestly, the Dutch East India Company just didn't find the land commercially viable compared to their super lucrative spice trade over in Indonesia. So the whole continent sat largely ignored by Europeans for another century, until Captain James Cook arrived on the scene. In 1770, Cook mapped the eastern shore, landed at Botany Bay, and ultimately claimed the entire eastern seaboard for Britain, calling it New South Wales. But here's the catch. Because it was just so incredibly far from Europe, Britain didn't actually settle it right away.
The actual settlement of Australia was driven by this fascinating geopolitical domino effect. In 1775, the American colonies rebelled against British rule. Now, for over a century, Britain had been shipping its convicts across the Atlantic to populate America. But when America won its independence, Britain suddenly lost its primary dumping ground for criminals. The prisons filled up fast. So, scrambling for a replacement, the British government turned their maps over to New South Wales.
So it's crucial to realize that modern Australia's founding was fundamentally an act of exile. In May 1787, the First Fleet, which was 11 ships carrying 1,400 convicts, guards, and officials, set sail from Britain. By January 1788, led by Governor Arthur Phillip, they landed at a natural harbor they named Sydney Cove. The conditions they faced were brutally harsh, but as convicts eventually finished their sentences, they became emancipated citizens. And very slowly, a burgeoning free population of ex-convicts, soldiers, and new British settlers actually began to expand this nascent little colony.
But as you can probably guess, this expansion brought compounding tragedies for the Aboriginal populations. Initially, the British did attempt some cooperation, but they unknowingly brought something utterly devastating: disease. With 65,000 years of isolation, Aboriginal peoples had absolutely no immunity to European illnesses. Just 1 year after the First Fleet arrived, a smallpox outbreak in 1789 killed about half the Aboriginal population in the Sydney region alone. And beyond disease, there were deep cultural misunderstandings. For instance, what the British viewed as Aboriginal people poaching their livestock,
the Aboriginal people viewed as traditional hunting on their own land. As settlers relentlessly pushed into the interior for farmland, this fierce competition over resources erupted into the frontier wars. These were violent, tragic confrontations that resulted in indiscriminate massacres on both sides, and they actually lasted well into the early 20th century.
Which brings us to Section 3, Gold, Rebellion, and Growth, the ultimate catalyst for change.
By the mid-19th century, Australia was already shifting from this autocratic penal outpost into a society of free settlers demanding democratic reforms. But the real game changer? It was discovered right beneath the soil. In 1851, a massive gold rush sparked an absolute population boom. To put this into perspective, look at how the population literally skyrockets over just 10 years, going from 430,000 in 1851 to almost 1.2 million by 1861. Immigrants were flooding in from Britain, America, China, all over the globe really. This massive influx completely overwhelmed the old penal system, which effectively ended convict transportation for good and injected an unbelievable amount of wealth into the economy. That money funded housing, sprawling cities, and vast rail networks.
But of course, a boom like that brings some serious friction. The heavy-handed colonial administration started imposing really strict taxes on all these new miners. And in 1854, this boiled over into a full-on open revolt at the Eureka Stockade. Now, the colonial military quickly defeated the rebel miners, but the broader public strongly supported the miners' plight for fair representation, and the miners were actually acquitted at trial. This exact moment at the Eureka Stockade is widely regarded today as the birth of a core Australian value: egalitarianism. It cemented this fierce, enduring belief in fairness and equal treatment before the law.
As the 19th century came to a close, a very distinct national identity had formed. In 1901, the 6 separate colonies officially federated into the Commonwealth of Australia. But we have to look at what happened next. One of the very first pieces of legislation they passed was the White Australia Policy. This was specifically designed to bar non-European heritage, particularly Asian immigrants, from entering the country. The source material for our explainer notes this was essentially an apartheid-like system created to restrict economic opportunities for non-white ethnicities and strictly preserve a British demographic makeup. It was a stark, restrictive reality of the nation's early legislative foundation.
Let's dive into Section 4, Forged in Global Conflicts, a nation truly tested. Entering the 20th century, this newly formed Commonwealth quickly found its identity, its values, and its loyalties violently tested on the global stage. When World War I broke out, Australia immediately answered Britain's call to arms, and the numbers here are sobering. Out of the 324,000 Australians who served overseas, most notably the Anzacs troops who fought at Gallipoli, a staggering 60,000 were killed and 150,000 were wounded. This was actually the highest casualty rate of any Allied force during the entire war. The immense bravery and totally selfless sacrifice of the Anzacs deeply, deeply scarred the young nation, but it also fundamentally unified the national psyche.
Following World War I, a massive geopolitical pivot occurred during World War II. Up until the 1940s, you see, Australia had relied entirely on London for its defense. But WW II changed absolutely everything. The Japanese Air Force launched direct bombing raids on Australian soil, hitting places like Darwin, Broome, and Townsville. Enemy submarines even raided Sydney Harbour. Recognizing that Britain, which was fighting for its own survival all across the globe, just couldn't protect them anymore, Australia made a permanent shift in its diplomatic and military strategy. They realigned their vital interests with the United States to secure survival in the Pacific theater, forever changing their foreign policy playbook.
And that leads us straight into Section 5, Building Modern Australia and the Massive Post-War Boom. After the dust settled from WW2, the country hit the gas pedal on modernization. Australia welcomed a massive influx of global immigrants to help rebuild, and the sheer scale of this migration from completely outside the British diaspora made that old White Australia policy entirely redundant in the face of economic reality, ultimately leading to its end. These new citizens filled crucial jobs, fueling a massive economic boom in manufacturing and infrastructure. On top of that, as the nation modernized, it finally began confronting its colonial past. There was a new focus on Indigenous affairs and official reconciliation efforts to address the centuries of historical injustices faced by Aboriginal peoples. This whole cultural coming of age was visually cemented on the world stage with the unveiling of modern icons like the breathtaking Sydney Opera House back in 1973.
So, it all comes back to this. How exactly does a nation built as an isolated, unforgiving prison adapt to become a crown jewel of the modern world? Through the tragedies of colonization, the fever of the gold rush, the devastating sacrifice of global wars, and the embracing of a massive, multicultural workforce, Australia has proven an unparalleled ability to adapt. It is a profound testament to human resilience, a society that began with people exiled to the harshest of conditions to be punished, who ultimately went on to build a nation where the rest of the world aspires to live. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this journey sparked your curiosity to learn even more about this fascinating continent.